demanded strong empirical support, while the Galileans were content with far-reaching, unsupported and partially refuted theories.
Again, I would argue that this statement is unjustified. Essentially, Feyerabend is invalidating Galileo's observations with the telescope predominantly on the basis of a poorly sketched lunar landscape, which he tells us does not match with the current understanding of the lunar landscape. Feyerabend goes on to argue that Galileo's publication would potentially have disrupted wider society at the time. However, this discussion seems to be outside of the main scope of the work, which is to address the use of method in science, and so I will not elaborate further on this. In this chapter, Feyerabend argues that the revolution in science had not begun with Galileo, and then discusses the work of both Copernicus and Maestlin. In both cases, he attempts to demonstrate that both astronomers used erroneous assumptions in arriving at their conclusions. In the case of Copernicus, he quotes from Commentariolus in looking for an alternative to equants, which were essentially constructs that enabled the empirical data to be reconciled with a view of the planets, which involved circular motion, and he again quotes from Copernicus in stating that this was to retain the rules that the ancient Greeks had set out. Again, this is outside of my field, and so I have sought preliminary information online, although I have not had first sight of the source material. This is tertiary source. Copernicus was said to have been aware of previous suggestions that the Earth moved by both Philolaus and Aristarchus. Again, from the same tertiary source material, Aristarchus was apparently attacked for his views. At the time of writing, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states that there have been misinterpretations of the quote from Commentariolus. Interestingly, their passage has subtle differences from the passage quoted by Feyerabend. Although the differences are not relevant to the argument, they do demonstrate that even these brief passages of text can be interpreted differently. The authors go on to suggest that Copernicus did not choose to utilize circular movements in his model for aesthetic reasons, to produce a simpler system than Ptolemy or under the influence of Hermetism or Neoplatonism. Instead, they suggest that it was made on the basis of a close analysis of the motion of the planets, and cite another source, again which I have not seen, Swerdlow and Neugebauer, 1984. Here again, therefore, there is some evidence against Feyerabend's argument that Copernicus's model was based on an erroneous assumption, and instead this lay with empirical observation. Without going into the arguments he raises against Maestlin, it is now possible to challenge Feyerabend's conclusion that the revolution was not accounted for by sophisticated empiricism, as he writes that
this is certainly not true for Copernicus. As we have seen, Copernicus thought the Ptolemaic system to be empirically adequate.
However, it has been suggested by Swerdlow and Neugebauer above that it was a more considered empirical observation of the planets that led to his conclusions. Feyerabend starts this chapter by asserting that there is no place in science for critical rationalism as suggested by Popper. He suggests that
criticism starts only after the discoveries are made.
Nevertheless, I would argue that when a theory is sufficiently robust, it allows for theoretical as well as experimental predictions. In other words, once a theory is well understood and supported by the evidence base, it becomes possible to advance sub-theories, theories that are contingent upon the original theory and which constitute a systematized group of hypotheses. This may exist in theory before it is explicitly tested, and therefore criticisms can arise at this stage before the formal process of empirical testing. The results of all of this is that the observations and theories do not necessarily develop together simultaneously, but can be separated distinctly if the above holds. Again, a little later, Feyerabend suggests that
a determined application of the methods of criticism and proof which are said to belong to the context of justification would wipe out science as we know it, and would never have permitted it to arise.
He suggests that there is a creative process much akin to an artistic process. That there is some similarity is not unreasonable, particularly when various scientists have described the methods by which their insights have arisen. the most notable case being Einstein's thought experiment on the speed of light and his theory of general relativity. Even this example, however, is too simple and does not describe the knowledge and previous work of Einstein in leading to this conclusion. Most likely, the creativity arises after significant preparatory work. It is reasonable, though, to suggest that people will use different approaches and that these approaches will be valid and will sometimes bear similarity to those processes used in the arts. Nevertheless, this again would benefit from empirical support, otherwise they remain as highly speculative suggestions. Later in the chapter, Feyerabend makes a remark about how the scientific process will affect the scientists themselves, and makes the suggestion that it will have a detrimental impact on their personality traits, and further quotes from Kierkegaard.
That my activity as an objective or a critical rational observer of nature will weaken my strength as a human being?
There are two rejoinders to this. Firstly, and in a rather light-hearted manner, much of Feyerabend's discussion consists of a rational attempt to justify a multiplicity of methods in science, and since science occurs in the natural world, for we are part of that world, his comments would apply just as much to the pursuits in this book. The second and more significant rejoinder is that this is a fairly broad statement, and ultimately quite vague, as there are numerous branches of science, multiple activities within science, and a wide variety of scientists of different temperaments and working for various periods of time within their fields. Feyerabend and Kierkegaard are firmly in the domain of psychology, and as such their assertions should be more precisely stated and supported by empirical evidence, particularly as there are so many factors involved as well as uncertainty about the characteristics in their statements which are being commented on. Feyerabend has also missed the opportunity to comment on the real issue here, which is the value system. Much of the criticism that I have in this chapter is the same. Thus Feyerabend goes on to say that, quote, institutions, ideas, practices, unquote, start from activities such as play, rather than starting from problems. The very fact that ideas and practice can start from problems suggests that this question is best answered by empirical study rather than speculation. He then argues that
a strict principle of falsification would wipe out science as we know it and would never have permitted it to start.